On October 28, 312, Maxentius kept his army behind Rome's walls instead of marching out to fight, and Constantine died in the dust outside the city he could not take. The Christian emperor who never was had crossed the Alps that year with perhaps 40,000 men, scattering Maxentius's garrisons at Augusta Taurinorum and Verona, certain that Rome would fall as easily. But the man waiting inside the Aurelian walls had learned patience. Twice before he had let invaders break themselves against his granaries and his stone, and twice before he had won by refusing to move. This time the Sibylline books warned him that the enemy of Rome would perish if he crossed the Tiber, and rather than gamble on the open field, Maxentius read the omen as a command to stay. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened, and why the real history unfolded differently. For the siege that followed bled the invader white, and what no one in that camp could yet see was how far the silence of a single battle would echo. Constantine's army was too small to encircle a city of 1,000,000 souls. His lines thinned, his foragers ranged farther each day, and the autumn rains turned his camps to mud while Maxentius's stores held full. When the Praetorian Guard finally swung the gates open and struck, they hit an army already starving and demoralized. The rout was swift. Somewhere in the press toward the Via Flaminia, the Augustus of the West went down, and the standard he had ordered marked with a strange monogram, a cross, a Chi-Rho seen in a vision the night before, fell with him into the river mud, unvindicated and soon forgotten. Maxentius did not merely survive. He inherited, with Constantine dead and his veterans leaderless, the provinces of Gaul and Britain had no Augustus to rally behind, and within a season their commanders made their peace with the man in Rome. Maxentius now held Italy, Africa, and the western frontier from Hadrian's Wall to the Atlas, a domain larger than any single ruler had governed since the Tetrarchy fractured. He entered the Senate not as a usurper clinging to one city, but as the restorer of Rome itself, and the senators who had long resented the soldier emperors of the frontier embraced him gratefully. He gave the credit where Roman tradition demanded it. The victory belonged to the gods of the city, to Jupiter on the Capitol, to Mars who guarded the legions, and above all to the old protective spirit of Rome that the Sibylline books had spoken for. Maxentius rebuilt temples, restored priesthoods, and stamped his coins with the genius of the Roman people. He was the emperor who had kept faith with the ancestors while a rival chased foreign signs to his death. That contrast would be remembered, and it would shape everything that came after. There was no Edict of Milan. There could not be, because the men who in our history issued it were either dead or had no reason to. Toleration was never written into imperial law, and the narrow mercy Galerius had granted from his deathbed in 311, the Edict of Serdica, which let Christians exist on sufferance in the East, remained exactly that, a grudging pause, not a guarantee. Without a Christian emperor to force the question, the pause quietly lapsed wherever local governors found it convenient to let it lapse. In the East, Maximinus Daia needed no encouragement. He had always regarded the cult as a sickness in the body of the empire, and he resumed his pressure on the churches, not the systematic fury of Diocletian's great persecution, but a steady attrition of confiscations, exclusions, and the occasional public trial. The faith was not exterminated. It was simply kept down, denied standing, made to understand that it lived at the pleasure of magistrates who owed it nothing. The empire did not reunite. Maxentius ruled the West, but the East remained divided between Licinius in the Balkans and Maximinus Daia beyond him, and the alliances that might have brought a single victor never formed. Licinius had been Constantine's ally, sealed by marriage to Constantine's half-sister Constantia, but with Constantine gone, that bond led nowhere, and Licinius turned to settle his own quarrel with Daia. Their wars ground on across Asia and Thrace, and when they exhausted each other, neither could turn west to challenge Maxentius's mass and his walls. So the Roman world settled into a thing it had not been for a generation. A stable division of three, then two great powers, each legitimate in its own provinces, none strong enough to swallow the rest. And in none of these courts did any emperor reach for the Christian church as an instrument of rule. There was no advantage in it. The church commanded no armies, held no granaries, and spoke for a minority that the cities still distrusted. It remained to every man who held real power, simply beneath notice. The emperors did need something to bind their soldiers and provincials together, and they found it where Aurelian had left it. Sol, Invictus, the unconquered sun, had been a state cult since 274, a god abstract enough to stand above the local deities of 100 peoples and martial enough to suit the legions. The rulers of the divided empire leaned on him heavily. Sol became the radiant patron beneath whom the older gods kept their altars, Jupiter and Mars, and the genius of Rome still honored, but increasingly understood as facets of a single solar power that shone on the just emperor. It was, in its way, a monotheism, or nearly one, a god of light and victory and order, worshipped from York to Antioch, requiring no break with the temples and no offense to the Senate. The soldiers swore by him, the mints struck him, the emperors styled themselves his companions, and the cross, which in another timeline would have risen over the legions, never found a single throne willing to raise it. Christianity did not die. It spread, as it had always spread, quietly, along the trade roads, through the workshops and the tenements and the networks of households where a new convert brought in a brother or a slave. Miltiades, Bishop of Rome, led his community as he had before the battle, a careful man shepherding an exposed minority in a city that belonged to other gods. The faith reached new cities and held the ones it had, but it stayed private, and being private, it stayed poor. Without an emperor's patronage, there were no great basilicas raised at public cost, no imperial subsidies, no bishops summoned to councils under the protection of the state. The grand machinery that in our history turned a persecuted sect into the spine of public life, the wealth, the unified hierarchy, the legal standing, the right to define orthodoxy and enforce it, none of it was built. The church remained a thing of conscience and congregation, deep in the lives of its members and invisible in the life of the empire. It endured. It simply never ruled. And then came the pressure that would test which gods the future belonged to. Across the Rhine and the Danube, Germanic and steppe peoples pressed against the long frontier, as they always had and always would, drawn by Roman wealth and pushed by movements deeper in the east. They came as raiders and as settlers, as federates hired to guard the very borders they had threatened, and as they came, they took on the colors of the world they entered. That world worshipped the sun, the peoples who in our history were converted to Christianity by missionary bishops, who became the Christian kingdoms of the post-Roman West, found instead a Rome whose soldiers swore by Sol Invictus and whose cities honored the old gods. A Gothic chief seeking legitimacy looked to the radiant patron of the emperors, not to a marginal cult of the poor. The religious map of the West formed along the lines of the cults that held power, and those lines were solar and traditional, not Catholic. There was no baptism of the barbarian kings, because there was no church with a throne to baptize them into. What descended from this Rome was not Christendom, because Christendom never formed. When the western provinces frayed and the central authority weakened, as in time it did, the institutions that survived the fraying were the old ones, the temples with their endowments, the civic priesthoods, the schools of rhetoric, the Roman law administered by Roman magistrates. Literacy and learning rested where they had always rested in the classical world, in the libraries of the cultivated and the records of the cities, not in monasteries that were never founded and cathedral schools that no bishop had the wealth to build. This was not a darker world, and it was not a brighter one. It was simply different. There was no single church to copy the manuscripts, or to crown the kings, or to claim a spiritual authority above the secular power. And so the long argument between throne and altar that shaped 1,000 years of European history never began. The idea that all the peoples of the West might belong to one faith, owe one allegiance, kneel before one cross, that idea never occurred to anyone, because nothing in their world suggested it. The faith of the carpenter persisted in quiet rooms, real and lived and small, and the question the historians of that timeline would never think to ask is the one our own history answers without us noticing. How much of everything we became rested on a single emperor, on a single morning, choosing to cross a river instead of staying behind his walls.